Sean Mallory woke slowly, like a man surfacing from the bottom of a quiet ocean. The cargo ship Driftwing hummed around him with the familiar low vibration of engines idling between star systems. Normally, that sound was comforting. It meant the ship was stable, the cargo was intact, and the autopilot hadn't decided to fly them directly into a sun while Sean was asleep. He stretched one arm lazily across the bed, eyes still closed, and immediately touched something warm. Sean paused. His mind, still halfway inside sleep, began sorting through possibilities. A blanket, a pillow. Maybe the emergency thermal suit he sometimes used as extra bedding during long runs. The thing beside him shifted slightly and breathed. Sean's eyes opened. For several seconds he simply stared at the ceiling while his brain attempted to reboot. Then very slowly he turned his head. A woman was sleeping in his bed. She lay on her side facing him, completely relaxed. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Her face looked almost human. Calm features, pale skin, long lashes resting gently against her cheeks. If Sean had seen her walking through a station corridor, he might have assumed she was just another traveler from one of the human colonies. Except for the ears. They were long and elegant, sweeping back through her hair like delicate curved blades. Sean blinked. He blinked again. Then he whispered quietly to himself, "Okay. Sean, think carefully. Did you drink anything unusual last night?" The ship's ceiling light flickered as the autopilot system announced in its polite, mechanical voice, "Good morning, Captain Mallory. Current location, uncharted transit corridor. Estimated arrival to Orion Gate in 6 hours." Sean didn't answer. He was still staring at the alien woman sleeping peacefully in his bed. She looked comfortable, very comfortable. One arm rested loosely across the blanket, as if she had been sleeping there all night. Her breathing was slow and steady. If this was a hostage situation, it was the calmest hostage situation Sean had ever seen. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Right," he murmured. "Step 1. Confirm reality." He reached out cautiously and poked the woman's shoulder. She was definitely real. Sean quickly pulled his hand back, like someone who had just discovered a very polite but extremely dangerous animal. His thoughts raced through every possible explanation. Did someone sneak aboard the ship? Impossible. The cargo bay required 3 levels of security and a biometric scan that refused to open even when Sean begged it nicely. Was this some kind of alien inspection officer? If so, she had a very unusual method of conducting surprise inspections. Or maybe, just maybe, Sean had finally worked so many long-haul cargo routes that his brain had decided to start inventing people for entertainment. "Yes," he whispered, "that seems likely." The woman shifted again. Sean froze instantly. She stretched slightly beneath the blanket, her long ears tilting as if reacting to distant sounds. For a moment, Sean wondered if alien ears worked like radar dishes. If that was true, she might have already detected his rising panic. Her eyes slowly opened. They were calm, intelligent, and deeply confused. For several silent seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then she spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "Good morning." Sean blinked again. "Morning," he replied automatically. Another pause followed. She looked around the small cabin, the metal walls, the navigation screens, the scattered tools Sean had left on a nearby table. "This," she said thoughtfully, "is not my bedroom." Sean nodded slowly. "No," he agreed. "I was about to say the same thing." The woman sat up carefully, the blanket sliding slightly as she examined the unfamiliar room with growing concern. Her long ears twitched once, like delicate instruments trying to process too much information at once. "My name is Elith," she said calmly. "May I ask where we are?" Sean leaned back against the wall beside the bed and crossed his arms. "Well," he said, "that depends." She looked at him. "On what?" Sean gestured vaguely at the bed between them. "On how you got into my locked cabin in the middle of deep space while I was asleep." Elith stared at him. Then she said something Sean would remember for the rest of his life. "I was hoping you might know." Sean stared at Elith for several long seconds, hoping that if he remained perfectly still, reality might quietly fix itself. Reality did not cooperate. Elith sat upright in the bed with calm dignity, which was impressive considering she had just woken up in the private sleeping quarters of a confused cargo pilot somewhere in deep space. Her long ears tilted slightly as she examined the small cabin with quiet curiosity. Sean finally cleared his throat. "All right," he said carefully. "Before we panic, accuse each other of espionage, or press the emergency airlock button by mistake. Let's start with basic questions." Elith nodded politely. "That seems reasonable." Sean gestured toward the metal door of the cabin. "That door," he said, "requires a palm scan, 2 passcodes, and a security system that screams like a dramatic opera singer if anyone touches it without permission." Elith looked at the door. It did not scream. "That's exactly my concern." Sean swung his legs off the bed and stood up, rubbing his temples as if that might help his brain catch up with the situation. "Okay, step 1, security logs." He walked to the control console beside the wall and tapped the screen. The ship's system responded instantly. "Accessing cabin entry logs," the computer said. Sean crossed his fingers. The screen displayed the data. Entry records, Sean Mallory, 2341, no other entries detected. Sean stared at the screen. Then he slowly leaned closer. Then he tapped the screen again, as if maybe the ship had accidentally forgotten how numbers worked. "No other entries," the computer repeated cheerfully. Sean looked back at Elith. "Well," he said, "either you are the galaxy's greatest stealth infiltrator." Elith raised an eyebrow. "Or," Sean continued, "you appeared in my bedroom through some kind of extremely illegal physics." Elith folded her hands thoughtfully. "I prefer the second explanation." Sean nodded. "Honestly, same." Elith stood up from the bed and walked slowly around the cabin, examining the small space with growing interest. The room was exactly what one would expect from a cargo pilot who spent months traveling alone. Navigation charts scattered across a table, tools sitting beside half-finished repairs, and a small food dispenser that looked slightly offended by how often it had been asked to produce noodles. Elith approached the dispenser. "What is this device?" Sean glanced over. "That," he said, "is the most disappointing chef in the known galaxy." Elith pressed one of the buttons. The machine whirred loudly and produced a steaming bowl of something that looked vaguely like soup, but had the emotional presence of wet cardboard. She stared at it. Sean shrugged. "See?" Elith poked the contents with a spoon. "Is it safe?" "Define safe." She placed the spoon down immediately. Sean returned his attention to the console and opened the ship's internal sensor logs. "Okay," he muttered. "If someone teleported you here, the sensors should show something." The computer processed the data. A moment later, a strange reading appeared. Sean frowned. "Well, that's interesting." Elith walked over. "What is it?" Sean pointed to the graph on the screen. "According to the ship's sensors, at approximately 3 in the morning, my cabin experienced a temporary spatial distortion." Elith studied the reading. "What kind of distortion?" Sean zoomed in on the data. "The kind," he said slowly, "that usually happens when space decides to behave like a very confused door." Elith looked at him. "Space is not a door." "Normally, yes." Sean tapped the screen again. "But for about 2 seconds last night, it kind of was." They both stared at the display. The distortion had appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. No ship had approached. No docking event had occurred. No teleportation signature matched any known technology. It was simply a hole, a brief wrinkle in reality itself. Elith's ears tilted slightly as she studied the data. "That reading looks familiar." Sean looked at her. "You've seen something like this before?" Elith hesitated. "I believe so." Sean leaned against the console. "Please tell me this explanation involves something normal, like smugglers, or pirates, or a very polite ghost." Elith shook her head gently. "It may involve something slightly more complicated." Sean sighed. "Of course it does." Elith turned to face him. "I was receiving medical treatment before I went to sleep last night." Sean raised an eyebrow. "For what?" She hesitated again. "For damage caused by dimensional radiation." Sean blinked. "Dimensional radiation?" "Yes." Sean slowly rubbed his face. "You know," he said, "when I woke up this morning, I thought the strangest part of my day would be finding an alien woman in my bed. He gestured at the sensor display. But now space itself apparently opened a door and dropped you into my cabin like misplaced luggage. Elith looked genuinely apologetic. I assure you this was not intentional. Sean nodded thoughtfully. Good, he paused. Because if this starts happening every night, I'm going to need a much bigger bed. Sean sat in the pilot's chair while the ship's communication array slowly aligned with the nearest relay satellite. Outside the wide front window of the cockpit, stars drifted quietly past like distant lanterns. Normally, Sean found the sight relaxing. Today, it mostly reminded him that somewhere out there existed a medical facility that might explain why an alien official had teleported into his bed during the night. Elith stood behind him with calm posture, watching the communication system with careful interest. Sean rubbed his hands together. All right, he said. We contact the medical station, politely explain that one of their patients accidentally visited my bedroom through a hole in reality, and then someone very intelligent fixes the problem. Elith nodded. That is an excellent plan. Sean looked over his shoulder. You say that like it might not happen. She hesitated slightly. The scientists overseeing the treatment are creative thinkers. Sean sighed. That's scientist language for something exploded during testing, isn't it? The console chimed. Communication link established, the ship's computer announced. A holographic screen flickered to life in front of them. A tall alien figure appeared, wearing a sleek uniform marked with unfamiliar symbols. His face looked stern, intelligent, and deeply tired, the universal expression of someone who had spent far too long dealing with complicated experiments. The moment he saw Elith standing beside Sean, his eyes widened. Administrator Elith? Elith gave a polite nod. Dr. Varen. The doctor leaned closer to the holographic display. Where are you? Sean leaned into the frame. Excellent question, he said. Also my question. The doctor's gaze shifted to Sean. And you are? Sean Mallory, cargo pilot, unintentional host of unexpected dimensional visitors. The doctor blinked slowly. I see. Sean pointed at Elith. She woke up in my bed. The doctor blinked again. I see. Sean folded his arms. Good, because I definitely do not. The doctor turned his attention back to Elith. Administrator, please confirm. Did the treatment cycle complete last night? Yes, Elith replied calmly. I went to sleep in the recovery chamber. The doctor pressed several controls on his console. Data began scrolling across the holographic screen. For a moment, the cockpit was silent, except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Then the doctor muttered something in his own language that sounded deeply concerned. Sean raised an eyebrow. That didn't sound like good news. The doctor looked up. It is complicated. Sean pointed at the starfield outside. We're in space. Everything is already complicated. The doctor took a slow breath. The treatment administrator Elith was undergoing involves neurological stabilization after exposure to dimensional radiation. Sean nodded slowly. Yes, she mentioned that part. Still sounds like a terrible vacation. The doctor continued. The therapy works by allowing the subconscious mind to temporarily explore stable points within nearby dimensional space while the brain repairs damaged neural pathways. Sean stared at him. I'm going to pretend that sentence made sense. Elith spoke quietly. The subconscious is guided to safe locations. Sean turned toward her. Safe locations. Yes, Sean pointed at himself. And somehow my bed is classified as one of those. The doctor cleared his throat. That appears to be the case. Sean leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Fantastic. The doctor continued scrolling through data. However, there is an irregularity. Sean groaned. There's always an irregularity. The doctor enlarged a cluster of strange readings. These are the dimensional travel logs recorded during the treatment cycle. Sean squinted at the screen. You're telling me her brain has travel logs? Yes. Sean rubbed his temples again. I need stronger coffee. Elith studied the data carefully. What do the logs show? The doctor hesitated. They show that your subconscious has accessed several locations across dimensional space. Sean pointed. Let me guess. He tapped the screen. One of those locations is my bedroom. The doctor nodded slowly. Not just once. Sean froze. What do you mean not once? The doctor adjusted the display. Multiple timestamps appeared. Sean leaned forward. Wait a second. He counted the entries. 3, 5, 8. He looked up. Doctor? Yes? Sean pointed at the list. According to this, her subconscious has visited my cabin multiple times. The doctor nodded again. Yes. Sean leaned back in his chair. Well, he gestured helplessly at Elith. Apparently you've been sneaking into my bedroom, across dimensions, without even knowing it. Elith looked equally surprised. I assure you, this is the first time I remember. Sean folded his arms. That's comforting. He paused. Actually, no, it isn't. The doctor studied the data again, his expression growing more serious. There is something else. Sean groaned loudly. Of course there is. The doctor pointed to a faint signal buried inside the dimensional readings. These traces suggest that the subconscious is not simply choosing random, safe locations. Elith's ears tilted slightly. What do you mean? The doctor looked directly at Sean. It appears to be choosing the same person. Sean blinked. I'm sorry? The doctor leaned closer to the screen. The subconscious mind tends to move toward places associated with safety, familiarity, and emotional stability. Sean pointed to himself again. Are you suggesting that across the entire galaxy, he gestured dramatically around the cockpit, her brain looked at everything and decided I'm the safest option? The doctor nodded calmly. That appears to be the case. Sean stared at Elith. Elith stared at Sean. Sean slowly leaned back in the chair. Well, he said quietly, that's either extremely flattering. He looked at the dimensional logs again. The universe has a very strange sense of humor. Sean spent the next 20 minutes staring at the dimensional travel logs like a man trying to understand why gravity had suddenly decided to take weekends off. The cockpit of the Driftwing was quiet except for the steady hum of the engines and the occasional polite beep from the navigation system, reminding Sean that his cargo shipment still existed and would probably appreciate arriving on time. Elith stood beside him, reading the same data with calm focus. Her long ears tilted slightly as her eyes moved across the holographic display. Sean finally broke the silence. So, he said slowly, your subconscious has been visiting my bedroom multiple times across different dimensional jumps? Yes. And your scientists apparently knew this. Apparently. And nobody thought it might be useful to warn the random human cargo pilot whose bed had become an interdimensional tourist destination. Elith gave him an apologetic look. That part of the treatment was unexpected. Sean leaned back in the pilot's chair. That's a very gentle word for what just happened. The holographic image of Dr. Varen was still hovering above the console. He looked like a man reviewing the results of an experiment that had become significantly more complicated than anticipated. Elith, he said carefully, you must understand that the therapy was designed to keep your subconscious within controlled dimensional pathways. Sean raised a finger. Let me guess. The doctor looked at him. Yes? Sean gestured at the glowing dimensional graph. It did not stay within controlled pathways. Dr. Varen exhaled slowly. No. Sean nodded. Fantastic. He swiveled the pilot's chair toward Elith. Just out of curiosity, he said, what exactly does dimensional radiation do to a brain? Elith answered calmly. It destabilizes certain neural patterns. Thoughts, memories, instincts. They begin to interact with the surrounding dimensional structure. Sean blinked. I'm going to pretend I understood that. The ship's computer chimed softly. Warning, cargo stability check recommended. Sean waved at the console without looking. Later. Then he turned back toward Elith. So your mind basically started wandering. Yes. And it wandered through space-time. Yes. And somehow it decided that the safest place to wander into was my bedroom. Elith nodded. That appears to be correct. Sean folded his arms. I don't know whether to be honored or concerned. Dr. Varen adjusted the display again. The dimensional logs expanded into a much larger map filled with faint glowing lines. Sean leaned forward. What's that? These, the doctor explained, are the subconscious pathways your mind has followed during the treatment cycle. Sean studied the map. There were dozens of faint lines crossing through the diagram like tangled threads. Then he noticed something. Hold on. He pointed at a cluster of bright signals near the center of the map. What are those? The doctor's expression changed slightly. Those are the strongest pathways. Elith leaned closer. They all converge in the same place. Sean looked at the label attached to the cluster. Then he squinted. Then he leaned even closer. Then he rubbed his eyes. Doctor. Yes? Sean pointed at the glowing coordinates. Those are my ship's coordinates. Yes. Sean counted the signals again. There were more than he expected. Not 3, not 5, more than 20. Sean slowly leaned back in his chair again. All right, he said quietly. That's getting weird. Elith's ears lowered slightly in surprise as she studied the data. My subconscious returned here that many times? Yes, the doctor replied. Sean gestured toward the map. Doctor, I'm not a scientist. That is obvious. Thank you. Sean pointed again at the display. But even I can tell something strange is happening here. The doctor nodded. Yes. Sean tilted his head. So why? Dr. Varen hesitated. That is what we are trying to understand. Sean rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You said the subconscious seeks familiarity. Yes. And safety. Yes. Sean gestured at himself. Well, I'm not exactly famous across the galaxy. Elith gave a faint smile. You seem very trustworthy. Sean raised an eyebrow. You've known me for, what, an hour? Approximately. And that's enough time to classify me as a safe interdimensional landing zone? Elith looked at him calmly. My subconscious has already made that decision. Sean sighed. I feel like I should charge rent. The ship's lights flickered briefly. Sean frowned. That's new. He checked the sensor panel. Another small dimensional ripple appeared on the display, the exact same kind they had seen earlier. Elith noticed it immediately. That's signal. Sean nodded slowly. Yeah. Dr. Varen leaned closer to his console. The dimensional field is fluctuating again. Sean looked at Elith. Please tell me you're not about to teleport again. Elith shook her head. I am fully awake. Sean looked back at the sensor reading. The ripple expanded slightly. Not large, but noticeable. Sean leaned forward. Well, he said quietly, that can't be good. The ship's computer chimed again. Dimensional disturbance detected in cabin sector. Sean closed his eyes for a moment. Then he looked at Elith. All right. He pointed toward the hallway leading to the sleeping quarters. Let's go see if reality is opening another door in my bedroom. Sean moved down the narrow hallway of the driftwing with the cautious expression of a man approaching his own bedroom as if it might suddenly develop teeth. Behind him, Elith followed calmly, though her long ears were angled forward with obvious curiosity. The holographic image of Dr. Varen floated beside them through the ship's portable projector, his face illuminated in faint blue light. The ship's computer spoke again in its perfectly calm voice. Dimensional disturbance increasing. Sean stopped outside his cabin door. Well, he muttered, that's encouraging. He placed his palm against the scanner. The door slid open with a quiet mechanical hiss. Sean leaned into the doorway and immediately froze. Inside the room, the air looked wrong, not dramatically wrong. Nothing was exploding. The bed was still there. His boots were still on the floor where he had thrown them the night before. But the space above the bed shimmered slightly, like heat rising from desert sand. Sean slowly stepped inside. Elith followed, studying the distortion carefully. The shimmering patch of air pulsed softly, stretching and shrinking as if the room itself were breathing. Sean folded his arms. All right, he said. I officially do not like that. Dr. Varen's hologram flickered slightly as he examined the phenomenon. That is a dimensional echo. Sean glanced at him. A what? A residual pathway created by Elith's subconscious travel. Sean pointed at the floating distortion. You're telling me her brain left a doorway in my bedroom? Essentially. Sean sighed deeply. I should start charging admission. The ripple in the air expanded slightly. Elith stepped closer, studying it with careful focus. It feels familiar. Sean looked at her. Familiar? She nodded slowly. Yes. Sean leaned against the wall beside the door. Please tell me it's not about to drop another version of you into my bed. Elith tilted her head thoughtfully. I do not think so. Sean waited. That was not a very confident answer. The distortion flickered again. For a brief moment the shimmer intensified, and faint images flashed inside the ripple like reflections on water. Sean squinted. Hold on. He stepped closer. Doctor, are those images? Varan's hologram leaned forward. Yes. Elith's ears tilted sharply as she stared into the shifting surface. The images lasted only seconds, but they were clear enough to recognize. Sean saw a room, not his cabin, a much larger room with tall windows overlooking a glowing alien city. Then the image changed. Now he saw a different place, some kind of starship bridge filled with unfamiliar equipment. Then another flash. This time he saw two figures standing side by side near the edge of a massive observation window. One of them was Elith. The other, Sean leaned closer. That looks like me. The image vanished instantly. The ripple shrank back into its faint, shimmering state. Silence filled the cabin. Sean slowly turned toward Elith. Okay, he pointed at the distortion. That thing just showed me a version of myself standing in a completely different spaceship. Elith looked equally unsettled. Yes, Sean rubbed the back of his neck. And judging by the way we were standing there, he paused. We seem to know each other. Dr. Varan studied the sensor data rapidly. This confirms the theory. Sean groaned. There's a theory now? Yes. Sean folded his arms. Of course there is. Varan enlarged the dimensional readings again. Elith's subconscious is not simply traveling randomly through dimensional space. Sean looked at the ripple again. Yeah, we figured that part out. The doctor continued. It appears to be following existing emotional pathways across parallel timelines. Sean stared at him. You're going to have to translate that. Elith spoke quietly. It means my mind may be connecting to other versions of reality. Sean nodded slowly. I suspected something weird like that, she continued. In those realities, we may already know each other. Sean looked at the distortion again. Apparently pretty well. The ripple flickered once more, briefly showing another fragment of a scene. This time Sean saw himself sitting at a table covered in star maps, while Elith leaned over his shoulder pointing at something on the display. The moment lasted less than a second. Then the room returned to normal. Sean exhaled slowly. Okay. He pointed at the empty air above his bed. So, what you're telling me... He looked at Elith. Is that somewhere out there in other timelines we've already met? Elith nodded. That is possible. Sean scratched his head thoughtfully. And your subconscious keeps coming here because... Elith hesitated. Because it recognizes you. Sean looked around his cabin. The messy tools, the terrible food dispenser, the very average bed. He sighed. Well, he said quietly, that's either extremely romantic. He glanced at the distortion again. Or the multiverse is playing a very elaborate joke on me. Sean sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faint shimmer floating above the mattress, like a man who had just discovered that his bedroom was secretly connected to the universe's most confusing hallway. The distortion pulsed softly, quiet and patient, as if waiting for someone to understand it. Sean pointed at it. I'm just going to say it, he muttered. I don't trust that thing. Elith stood beside the wall console, studying the readings from the portable scanner Dr. Varan had asked her to activate. The faint blue light from the device reflected in her eyes as data streamed across the small screen. It is stable, she said calmly. Sean nodded slowly. That is somehow more worrying. Dr. Varan's hologram hovered near the doorway, reviewing the information coming from the ship's sensors. The dimensional field is weakening, the doctor explained. Sean glanced at him. Weakening sounds good. It means the pathway is losing energy. Sean crossed his arms. That also sounds good. Varan hesitated slightly. However, the pathway will likely reappear again tonight. Sean leaned back on his hands and looked at the ceiling. Of course it will. Elith turned toward him. The therapy cycle is still active. My subconscious will enter the dimensional state again when I sleep. Sean slowly sat up. And your brain will start traveling through the multiverse again. Yes, Sean pointed at the bed. And it will probably come back here. That appears likely. Sean rubbed his face. Well, that's a new responsibility I didn't expect. Elith approached the bed and looked at the fading ripple of energy. In the other timelines we saw... Sean raised a finger. Before we continue, I'd like to officially state that I did not authorize the universe to show me alternate versions of my life. Elith gave a faint smile. I understand. Sean pointed toward the place where the distortion had been strongest. In one of those flashes, we were standing on some kind of command bridge. Yes. And in another, we were looking at star maps. Yes. Sean leaned forward. And we seemed comfortable. Elith's ears tilted slightly. Yes. Sean stared at the floor thoughtfully. Well, that's strange. Elith waited. Sean looked back up. Because I don't remember ever meeting you before today. I do not remember either. Sean pointed toward the scanner. But apparently our brains disagree. Elith studied the readings again. The subconscious mind is capable of recognizing patterns across dimensional structures. Sean blinked. You keep saying things like that. Yes. And I keep pretending I understand them. Elith laughed quietly. It was the first time Sean had heard it, and the sound briefly made the strange situation feel almost normal. Sean leaned back again. So your mind has been wandering through other timelines? Yes. And in those timelines, he gestured between them, we've met before. That appears to be correct. Sean scratched the side of his head. Okay. He looked around his cabin. Let's assume the multiverse is telling the truth. Elith waited patiently. Sean continued. In those other realities, what exactly are we? Elith thought for a moment. In the images we saw, we appeared to be allies. Sean nodded slowly. That's good. She hesitated slightly. In some cases, possibly more than allies. Sean froze. What defined possibly? Elith looked slightly amused. The emotional resonance in those memories suggests a strong connection. Sean leaned back dramatically. Fantastic. He gestured toward the ceiling. So somewhere out there are alternate versions of me who apparently figured out how to build relationships with alien officials. Elith crossed her arms lightly. You sound skeptical. Sean laughed. I'm a cargo pilot who eats instant noodles 3 times a day. He pointed at himself. This is not the resume of a man involved in important multiversal relationships. The ship's computer chimed again. Approaching Orion Gate. Arrival in 4 hours. Sean sighed. Great. He looked at Elith. So tonight your brain goes traveling again. Yes. And if the scientists are right, he gestured at the bed again. You might teleport back here. That is possible. Sean thought about that for a moment. Then he stood up. Well, he said, stretching his arms, if we're going to run a multiverse sleep experiment in my bedroom? Elith raised an eyebrow. Yes? Sean grabbed a chair from the corner and placed it beside the bed. I'm staying awake. Elith tilted her head. You intend to watch me sleep? Sean pointed at the ceiling dramatically. Last time I slept through this, the universe opened a door in my bedroom. He sat down in the chair. This time I'm supervising. Sean discovered 2 important things about staying awake to supervise an alien official's multiversal sleep experiment. First, cargo ship coffee was not designed for heroic scientific vigilance. Second, watching someone sleep was incredibly boring for the first 3 hours. He sat in the chair beside his bed with a mug in one hand and the ship's scanner in the other, trying very hard to look like a responsible guardian of dimensional stability. In reality, he mostly looked like a tired man, slowly losing an argument with gravity. Elith lay peacefully on the bed, her breathing steady, her long ears resting softly against the pillow. She had insisted that if her subconscious truly followed familiar pathways, then the safest test would be to allow the process to happen naturally again. Sean had agreed, though mostly because the alternative explanation, locking her inside a cargo container labeled "Do Not Teleport," had not been approved by Dr. Varon. The cockpit clock ticked quietly. Outside the window, the Orion Gate glowed faintly in the distance, a massive ring of energy marking one of the busiest transit points in the sector. Sean blinked slowly. Then the scanner beeped. He sat upright immediately. The air above the bed shimmered. The same distortion from before slowly formed again, like invisible water rippling through the room. The scanner's display lit up with spikes of dimensional energy. Sean leaned forward. "Well," he whispered, "there it is." Elith shifted slightly in her sleep. The distortion grew brighter. Dr. Varen's hologram activated automatically beside the wall console. "The dimensional pathway is opening again," the doctor said calmly. Sean pointed at the scanner. "Yep, my bedroom is officially a doorway to the multiverse." Inside the ripple, faint images began to flicker again. Sean leaned closer. This time the visions were clearer. He saw another starship bridge, much larger than the driftwing. Elith stood there wearing formal armor marked with symbols of authority. Sean stood beside her in a uniform he had never owned. Then the scene changed. A distant planet filled the sky beyond a glass observation deck. Elith laughed at something Sean said while pointing toward the stars. Another flash. This time they were standing together in what looked like a crowded diplomatic chamber, arguing with several alien representatives while Sean gestured dramatically with a datapad. Sean blinked. "I talk with my hands in every universe, apparently." The images continued. Different ships, different worlds, different versions of the same two people. Sometimes serious, sometimes laughing, sometimes simply standing quietly together, watching distant suns. Sean felt something strange stir in his mind, like memories trying to surface from very deep water. Dr. Varen spoke softly. "The subconscious connection is stabilizing." Sean glanced at him. "What does that mean?" "It means Elith's mind has stopped searching." Sean looked back at the ripple. "Searching for what?" The doctor studied the data carefully. "For the place it already recognizes." Elith slowly opened her eyes. The ripple of energy dimmed instantly, fading like a closing door. She sat up calmly and looked around the cabin. Sean leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, "welcome back." Elith looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You stayed awake." Sean lifted the empty coffee mug. "Heroically." She glanced at the scanner. "Did the pathway open again?" Sean nodded. "And we saw more of those other timelines." Elith watched him carefully. "What did you see?" Sean scratched the back of his neck. "Apparently in several versions of reality, I make terrible diplomatic speeches." Elith smiled faintly. "That sounds possible." Sean pointed toward the place where the distortion had been. "But one thing was always the same." She waited. Sean shrugged. "You were always there." Elith sat quietly for a moment. Dr. Varen reviewed the final readings and then nodded with visible relief. "The neural patterns are stabilizing. The treatment has succeeded." Sean blinked. "Just like that?" "Yes." The doctor smiled slightly. "Once Elith's conscious mind accepted the connection her subconscious had already formed, the dimensional instability resolved itself." Sean leaned back. "So the cure was basically understanding what was already happening." "Correct." Elith looked at Sean thoughtfully. "In every timeline my mind visited, you were present." Sean rubbed his chin. "Well, statistically speaking, the universe could have chosen someone with a nicer ship." Elith laughed quietly again. Outside the window, the Orion Gate grew larger as the driftwing approached. The ship's computer chimed. "Arrival in 30 minutes. Dr. Varen's hologram flickered. "Elith, a transport vessel will meet you at the gate." She nodded. "Understood." The hologram faded. Silence filled the cabin for a moment. Sean stood and stretched. "Well," he said, "that was the strangest cargo run of my career." Elith stood beside him. "You handled it well." Sean grinned. "I supervised a multiverse sleepwalk in my bedroom. That deserves a medal." She looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "In other timelines, we seem to meet again and again." Sean shrugged lightly. "Apparently we have a habit of crossing paths." Elith studied him for a moment longer. "Perhaps this timeline will not be so different." Sean looked out at the glowing Orion Gate, then back at her. "Well," he said with a small smile, Next time you feel like visiting across dimensions, he gestured toward the bed. You already know where the safest place in the universe apparently is. Elith smiled, and for the first time since waking up that morning, Sean felt strangely certain that somewhere, across countless stars and countless realities, the story between them had only just begun.